So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining DataCon LA 2020. Welcome to Data for Good Track. And soon we'll be listening to Reframing Intimate Partner Violence as a Systemic Economic Issue using Data session. I am Ritesh, your host, and your co-host today is Thomas. We'll be moderating the chat and Q&A for you during the session. So today our guests are Kirkley and Tanya, and they will be taking us through the session. So Kirkley is the Director of Data and Research at FreeFrom, and Tanya is the Director of Service Provider Engagement and Education at FreeFrom. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Kirkley and Tanya, and you can introduce yourself and then drive the presentation. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to take 1 second to share my screen with everyone. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yes, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us on a Saturday afternoon. We really appreciate it. Like Ritesh said, my name is Kirkley Doyle. I'm the Director of Data and Research at FreeFrom. And this is my colleague, Tanya. And we are going to be talking to you about intimate partner violence today. The title of our talk is Reframing Intimate Partner Violence as a Systemic Economic Issue Using Data. Tanya, I don't know if you want to add a little intro for yourself at all.
Yeah, hi everybody. So my name is Tanya Ventura. I'm the Director of Service Provider Engagement and Education at FreeFrom. So I'm excited to be here. My pronouns are she, her, hers.
Awesome. Okay, so just a brief overview of our agenda today. We're going to give you a little bit of an introduction to FreeFrom, the nonprofit where we both work, and tell you a little bit about how we think about intimate partner violence and our approach to the issue, and then take you through our recent safety fund, which is a project where we distributed unrestricted cash grants to survivors during COVID-19, and tell you some of the takeaways. And then we'll give you a few resources and then have about 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A, which is through WOVA. So if you have any questions, go ahead and submit those through the app. And I'm going to hand it over to Tanya for the first section.
Thank you, Kirkley. So to start off by letting you all know a little bit about who we are. And again, apologies for the technical difficulties at the beginning. We did not realize we were recording or that we were live. So thank you so much for bearing through that. But FreeFrom is a nonprofit organization based out of Los Angeles, California, but that does work nationally. So we partner with both the nonprofit sector and the corporate sector to really create pathways to financial security for survivors. So we envision a world where survivors have sustainable income, savings, and credit from which to build wealth, and the resources to support individual, intergenerational, and community healing. We take a very holistic approach to this, and we use data, technology, peer-to-peer networks, trainings for domestic violence and gender-based violence shelters, as well as policy advocacy. We even have a social enterprise, Gifted. Check us out. If you are shopping for gifts right now, please, please, please try to check out and give our social enterprise Gifted a chance, and other cross-sector solutions. Next slide. We're going to start a little bit by giving you all a brief overview of the problem. So the problem that we are trying to solve and the problem that we were trying to solve through this safety fund that we'll be presenting on today. Next slide. So just to give you a brief snapshot about how prevalent gender-based violence is, and by gender-based violence, what I mean is any pretty much type of violence that is affected by gender inequity. So that can be domestic violence, that can be sexual assault, that can be gender-based hate crimes, it can be human trafficking, so on and so forth. And to give you some stats, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 2 trans people will experience gender-based violence in their lifetime. So if you know women, if you know folks who are trans, you very likely know survivors. The number 1 reason survivors don't leave or return to an abusive situation is financial insecurity. And it costs about $104,000 to survive domestic violence. So that means that a survivor loses $104,000 just from surviving intimate partner violence. 99% of all survivors also experience financial abuse as part of the domestic violence that they endured. So what this pretty much means is experiencing gender-based violence is financially devastating for most people, and survivors can only secure long-term safety for themselves and their children if they can afford to leave, rebuild, and heal. Next slide. And some of y'all might be wondering, well, what is economic abuse? We completely understand that this might be a new thing for many of you. So hopefully this explanation helps, but feel free to send us some questions through WOBA. I haven't figured out how to say that yet. But what economic abuse is tactics that control a survivor's ability to acquire, use, and maintain economic resources, thus threatening the survivor's potential for self-sufficiency by creating financial dependence on the harm doer. And the harm doer is the person causing harm. So that's the person that's causing violence or abuse onto the survivor. And what it pretty much is just another control tactic. Next slide, please. Examples of what economic abuse looks like can be interfering with employment and or education, controlling access to resources. Over 73% of survivors report their harm doers make them ask for money and or decide how they can spend it. This could also look like putting folks on very, very restrictive budgets, or I'm forgetting the word, just a very restrictive amount of money that they can use, and exploiting resources. So 52% of survivors report having experienced coerced or fraudulent debt, with 46% reporting damage credit as a result. So we've worked with survivors who, after leaving an abusive relationship, or maybe during a relationship, they find out that the person that they are with or the person that is causing them harm has taken out many credit cards in their name without their consent, or has forced them into debt. So, for example, force them to get them a car under the survivor's name, which, you know, the harm doer may not pay. So that's what we mean by exploiting resources. Next slide, please. And why does economic abuse matter? So like we mentioned in our first slide, 99% of survivors experience economic abuse. What this means is that it financially devastates a survivor. So survivors often cannot leave or don't have the option to leave harmful situations because they are so financially devastated. And if they do leave, they leave with a lot of debt, a low credit score, maybe no savings, maybe no access to income. And as you can imagine, it's very hard to rebuild without those access to finances. It's a negative effect that reaches way beyond a survivor's finances, especially if they have children. So that's really when you start to see the intergenerational cycle of violence. And as we all have probably learned, that wealth generation is also intergenerational. So if a survivor finances are stolen from them or hurt, damaged by abuse, then that will also carry on to the next generation and can affect the next generation as well. Next slide, please. Let's jump into a little bit about how COVID-19 has impacted survivors. Excuse me. Incidents of domestic violence in the US have skyrocketed as survivors are trapped at home in isolation with their harm doers. So I'm sure that many of you probably saw in the news that incidents of domestic violence are skyrocketing. Folks are scared to go to authorities right now because there's just so many different inequities happening due to this pandemic. And I think this pandemic has really highlighted a lot of the issues that FreeFrom has been working on for many years, but more specifically that domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, any word that you want to use for it, is a systemic issue, and therefore we must treat it as a systemic problem. One of the things that we're seeing specifically with survivors of color is that police are getting called more, and therefore survivors and people of color are being criminalized or put in harm's way. For example, 64.4% of police officers think DV offenders must be arrested even when the survivors don't feel it's necessary. Another one is 88% of survivors report that police sometimes or often did not believe them or blame them for the abuse. So it's not uncommon that even though the survivor is being harmed in that incident, that maybe the police blame them or process them or also press charges on the survivor, even though that survivor didn't have any partake in the harm. And then another issue that happened was that shelters across the country closed their doors because of the COVID-19 health regulations. And what this meant is effectively it cut off access to resources for survivors all over the nation. So if they needed housing, they didn't have anywhere to go. If they needed resources, they didn't have anywhere to go. So it really created a problem where survivors were stuck at home and had no options. The pandemic has made it more difficult than ever for survivors to make and save the money they need to get to safety. So as you can imagine, being trapped in a home or being trapped in an environment where you're not safe and you already don't have access to finances, what we heard from survivors, and Kirkley will get into it a little bit more, about some of the financial repercussions that happened specifically in this moment, maybe with some stimulus checks, maybe with access to income or any of the public benefit and support that happened during this time. Survivors were really not able to access a lot of that. Next slide. So a little bit about our response. Next slide, please. So FreeFrom, I always get excited about this part. FreeFrom decided that in April of 2020, we launched an open application for survivors to apply for a one-time, no strings attached cash grant. And the reason why we did this was because, as I mentioned, we saw incidents of DV skyrocketing, unemployment skyrocketed. Due to the economic abuse survivors that they were experiencing, were not able to access money. So like I mentioned, unemployment, paychecks, stimulus checks. And this kind of fund didn't exist yet. So we were kind of waiting for a larger domestic violence, maybe national hotline or coalition to do a fund like this, because we were seeing so many different funds popping up all over the nation, but we didn't see one for survivors. And survivors were asking for this help. And since FreeFrom does a lot of work in the financial space, we were getting those requests from survivors about how can I access resources? I need help. Like I need some support right now when it comes to financial concerns that I may have or challenges. So we launched this fund, and from April to June, FreeFrom has dispersed 1,100 grants to survivors in 36 states and Puerto Rico, and the average grant that we gave out to survivors was $244. Thank you. The data we collected, to give you a little brief overview about some of the things that we were interested in learning from the safety fund, is so the safety fund had no strings attached, very easy to get to. Really, you only had to identify as a survivor, and that was pretty much it. But we also took this opportunity to learn some information about survivors. So there's a lot of knowledge gaps in the experiences of survivors. Like we know the stats about 1 in 4 and 1 in 2, and it costs $104K in recovery costs, but we didn't know much beyond that. And one of the reasons for that is because there's a lot of fear and a lot of unknown about how to work with survivors and collect data and research from survivors. So we took this opportunity to not only get survivors the cash that they needed to stay safe during this pandemic, but also learn and collect data about their experiences. So we were curious about survivors' needs, what support survivors needed during COVID-19, what services they would like to receive from the domestic violence movement or other organizations, what survivors would like when we're talking about expanding systems of support to look like. So what other community members or institutions in our society can they tap into and get support from? And like I mentioned, the gaps in knowledge that we were specifically trying to close was that we didn't really understand the full cost of economic abuse, and we really wanted to understand the financial well-being of survivors. Next slide. And one of the things that became very, very important in this whole process, for like I mentioned, for a long time, this movement has operated from a shelter base. FreeFrom has never really been a shelter or a drop-in. I got muted. I don't know why. Sorry, y'all. But we wanted to build trust through online means, and language became very, very important. Language has power, and our intention to build trust with survivors had to come through in that application, which was oftentimes the only contact we had with survivors. Oh, I think someone's unmuted. Oh, go back, sorry. We also took a very inclusive definition of survivors. So like I said, that was one of the requirements to apply for the safety fund, is that you had to identify as a survivor. But we took a very inclusive definition to that. So folks who were maybe childhood survivors, or who grew up with DV or gender-based violence in their home or in the community and self-identified as a survivor, very much qualified. We use people first language, so centering people's humanity over their identities. So for example, this is very common in the community of people who have disabilities. So we use that type of language to center people's humanity over their identities. We did our best to not use nonviolent language throughout the application, to not re-trigger any survivors. And we were very honest about the explanations that we gave throughout the application and the survey. So we were very honest about, like, this is the absolute mandatory information that we need, which is your name, your contact information, how can we pay you in our US survivor, and how do we safely contact you. And that was it. That was all pretty much that was required. Everything else was optional. And we had many reminders about how that was optional, and in the most like nice, welcoming language that we could. So we really wanted to help survivors feel like they were working with an individual, even though it was a SurveyMonkey application. We also used trauma-informed care, which allowed us to create a safe space online. So we were very honest about things like what information we needed, which questions were optional. We were honest with survivors about what was optional and what was mandatory to fill out. And we were very, very mindful about the power dynamic between the person giving money, which was us as a nonprofit, and the person requesting support. So we didn't want to re-traumatize anybody. We didn't want anybody to feel like they had to prove that they needed this money. We didn't want to necessarily have folks make a case for, you know, why they needed this money or why they were a survivor. We were just trusting, and we were very, very mindful of how those power dynamics sometimes play out when it's an institution or an agency giving money, and then there's a person asking for money. Next slide, please. Now we're going to jump into some key takeaways quickly.
Thanks so much, Tanya. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to jump right into some of the data. So we'll start with a few basics. So some demographics about our sample. I also just want to mention that we, as Tanya mentioned, the grants were up to $250, an average of $244, and that survivors could receive them either via PayPal, check in the mail, or direct deposit. And like she said, those were really the only things that we required. So we gave out 1,100 grants, but we actually got applications from 1,300 survivors. We are currently fundraising and trying to meet those waitlist demands, but the data in this report and that you'll see on the following slides is from 1,300 survivors from 36 states and Puerto Rico. Survivors, we had a really diverse sample. Survivors ranged in age from 18 to 71, with an average age of 37. And then on the next few slides, I'm going to cover a little bit about the genders, sexualities, and race and ethnicities amongst the survivors who received grants. So starting with gender, we gave folks a lot of options to select their identity. We also gave options to self-describe and prefer not to say. So we really tried to be very, very inclusive here. As you can see, 88% of our sample did identify as female, but the remaining 12% represent a range of different genders. And at FreeFrom, we're always trying to serve all survivors, particularly survivors who are typically left out. So this is something we are proud of and always, working on as we consider ways to continue to support survivors, to reaching all survivors. In terms of the sexuality of survivors who received our grant, 63% were heterosexual or straight, and the remaining 37% either preferred not to say, self-described, or identified with a range of different sexualities. And then in terms of race and ethnicity, we had a really diverse sample. We kind of broke down roughly into quarters. So we had 31% Latinx, 29% white, 26% Black or African American, and then the remaining quarter representing a range of other races and ethnicities. And, as with all of these questions, we're always trying to think about how can we be as inclusive as possible. And, we gave folks options to prefer not to say and self-describe, but particularly with this race and ethnicity question, we really wanted to give folks an open-ended way to talk about their identity as well, because we know these types of boxes are not always really very friendly. So we gave survivors an option to also say a different race or ethnicity, and we got more than 100 unique identities from that open-ended. So it's really quite a diverse group of survivors that we were able to reach. Okay, I'm gonna move this back over here. So the first thing I'll start out with is that what we gave in the application, and as Tanya said, all these questions were totally optional, but we had really high response rates. Like this, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's financial well-being scale. It's a 10-question index that is a plain language tool that creates a comparable score for financial well-being. And the CFPB has done a lot of research, so you can kind of situate that score that someone gets in the broader financial well-being of American adults. And this question, we had over 90% of survivors complete. So even though it was optional, we really had a high level of engagement for a lot of these questions. And what we learned from the financial well-being scale is that survivors are very financially insecure across the board. The average score for survivors in our sample was 16 points lower than that of the average adult in the United States. And the scale runs roughly from about 14 to about 80. The average American adult sits at about 54. So the survivors in our sample were significantly lower than that. We also learned that on average, they were 4 times more likely than the average American adult to have experienced material hardship, like food insecurity or not being able to afford housing in the past year. And according to their scores, they have on average less than $250 in savings. And you might be thinking like, well, isn't this just COVID? And it's a valid question. This data was collected, like Tanya mentioned, from April to June of this year. And so like with many Americans, the situation with COVID was economically impacting a lot of folks, but there's really the situation of survivors and economic abuse and the costs associated with it, like Tanya mentioned, really mean that these scores, while they may have been impacted by COVID, are meaningful generally to think about the economic well-being of survivors. And one of the things that we learned, like Tanya said earlier, that $104,000 statistic from the CDC, that's mostly medical costs and lost productivity. And there's not this type, we didn't have any data really asking survivors, what's the cost of the economic abuse? Like, what are these other costs that survivors are dealing with? So we asked them these types of costs to just estimate for us. And what we learned is that on top of that $104,000, that harm doers are stealing on average $1,200 from survivors each month, restricting their freedom to spend an additional roughly $1,000 of their own money as they see fit each month. And that harm doers are incurring an average of $15,000 in coerced and fraudulent debt in survivors' names each year. And that survivors lose out on about $23,000 of income every year and incur $17,000 in property damage costs each year. And so these are this is new data that we kind of uncovered through this process, and it's really quite staggering. So if you think about the economic abuse and things that sort of happen to survivors under normal circumstances, you can imagine a situation, as Tanya was alluding to earlier, about the ways in which COVID-19 really exacerbated that situation. And what we learned from survivors is they were kind of experiencing 4 key things as a result of COVID-19. Escalating violence, fewer financial resources, making it harder to get or stay safe, theft of stimulus checks and other COVID-19 related assistance, and then slowed court proceedings due to closures and the courts not seeing not immediate cases, which keeps survivors in contact with their harm doers and delays potential income like child support. And these are 4 quotes from survivors. We gave them several opportunities to sort of share in an open-ended format their experiences. So I'm just going to give folks a couple minutes or a little bit of time to just go ahead and read these. They are just examples. We have our full report on this initiative. There's a link to it in both Tanya and I's speaker bios, which has a lot more, but these are kind of 4 4 quotes we wanted to help you all illustrate a little further. So I'll just give a few seconds. And like I said, these are available in our report along with a lot of others. So if you didn't get a chance to read all of them, they're definitely available. And the slides will be as well after the presentation. Okay, so now that we've kind of established the survivors' financial circumstances and during COVID-19, we wanted to understand, like, how can we help? Wanting to understand what it is that survivors need and really generating data around that to be able to use it ourselves to make sure our initiatives and programs going forward to support survivors are really driven by their needs, and also to be able to share widely with partners and just everyone as are serving survivors during this time. So what we learned are survivors' top needs right now are cash to spend as needed, so unrestricted cash, utility bill relief, and credit and debt relief. And survivors reported that on average, they needed $730 to stay safe right now. And that figure is really interesting. We didn't give a time bound on it. So it wasn't, how do you need this again, or how long is it going to last? We thought we wanted to understand what survivors would quantify what they needed right now, that they could spend immediately on whatever they needed, that whatever would help them most move towards safety. And what's interesting is from the first 20 or so applicants all the way to over 1,300, this number stayed remarkably consistent. It hovered between $700 and $800 the whole time. So we were really confident that it's an accurate assessment of what survivors need right now. And in terms of other costs associated, like the way that we typically think about funding domestic violence, prevention and other resources, $730 is really a small amount of money in the broader picture. So this is how survivors spent their grants. We don't at FreeFrom think there are any costs that are the right costs for survivors to be covering. We think everyone knows their own circumstances and what they need to get and stay safe, and they should spend accordingly. But what we wanted to kind of understand what they were spending it on. And these are the top 3 things that survivors use their grants to cover were food, household items, like toiletries and cleaning supplies, and utilities. And this kind of unrestricted cash support isn't the norm, but we really are hopeful that understanding these types of costs, even though we aren't deeming them the right costs, but that they really are basic, and that the best thing that we can do is trust survivors to spend it as they need, and that this is a sort of evidence of that. So we're hoping that kind of does away with any thought that survivors shouldn't be trusted to spend money as they see fit. And another thing that we learned were that survivors used the cash grants to cover a range of costs that maybe on the surface don't seem like they're immediately related to safety, but they really were. And survivors told us that covering things like car repairs or purchasing new clothes for a new job were really central to their safety. And it really, not only is giving survivors cash that they can spend the right thing to do and the just thing to do, but it's actually the most cost effective, and it helps them get to safety sooner and quicker. So I'm going to share 2 more survivor quotes that sort of illustrate that, and I'll read one of them. "The cash came just in time to fix my car. Not having a vehicle makes it difficult to get groceries. I use EBT, so I can't order online. Also, my child's dad has threatened to keep her or change custody when I don't have transportation to drop her off at the court-ordered time and location. So the timing of this grant was a huge relief." And this quote really illustrates that what this survivor needed to maintain custody of their child and to provide food and to stay safe was to fix their car. And while we may not think that's an immediate safety cost, it really is. And so we're hoping that this data sort of illustrates that piece, that we really need to be trusting survivors. So now that we kind of have a landscape of where survivors are at and what their needs are going forward, we're going to talk a little bit about where we go from here. So as Tanya said in the beginning, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 2 trans folks will experience intimate partner in their violence in their lifetime. This is not a personal problem, it is a societal problem. And we can see these kind of economic things compounding as part of this. And so what we really need to do is to expand the infrastructure. We need to bring more people, more institutions to come together and support survivors and really expand the type of support that's available. And what we learned from survivors, and we asked them, was that if they knew that places like religious institutions, banks who maybe provided additional fraud protections on their accounts, or credit card companies who might help them address coerced or fraudulent debt, or employers or health insurance companies, if those places provided support for survivors, that overwhelmingly they would seek it. But up to this point, they haven't sought it because it's not available. And so really sort of driving this piece with survivors right at the center, that this is the type of support that they are looking for. And I'm going to hand it back to Tanya for the last little bit.
Thanks, Kirkley. I always get so excited about that data, and I hope you all did too. So what can you do for the folks joining us today and watching the recording? I think one of the most important things is understanding that gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, intimate partner violence is not a private issue. It is not just an issue that must be handled by the intimate partner violence movement. There's a piece that we can all take and start to address, in whether it's in our community, whether it's in our work, whether it's in academia, whatever it may be. We all have a piece. We all have a part to play, and we must all heed the call to action. You are welcome to read our full report on this data. Like Kirkley said, that is available in both of our bio pages, or our speaker bio pages. And then there's also a COVID-19 response guide, which outlines steps that individuals, communities, institutions, and the government can take to support survivors and prioritize survivor wealth now and going forward. So these are the links, and like we mentioned, they are available on our speaker pages. Next slide, please. And just to give you a little info about how you can continue to work with us, if you're interested in funding the safety fund, like Kirkley mentioned, we are hoping to reopen it again and start to collect more interesting data that will really help us will help us represent the experiences of survivors during this moment and beyond. If you want help with starting peer-to-peer financial support groups for survivors, and you can contact M. Jackson. We also have an amazing compensation compass tool that helps survivors understand what avenues to compensation are available to them, and you can access that on this website. If you're looking to create more survivor-centered workplaces, so maybe you want to create more employment policies that protect survivors in the workplace, because that is one of the ways that survivors experience economic abuse, you can contact Amy Durrance. And if you're interested in doing more survivor wealth policy, we have a survivor wealth policy group that you are more than welcome to join, and you can contact Sabrina Ham. So thank you so much. I've been keeping an eye on the questions, and I don't think we have any, but maybe I missed them. Oh, maybe we do.
Just want to know, yeah.
So, but here's our contact information. Please follow us. Please stay in contact. Like I said, we have a social enterprise. So right now is a great time to purchase some gifts. And we have a Scorpio box. So if there's any Scorpios out there.
Right.
Like me.
Yeah. Hey, Tanya and Kirkley, that was great. Like, this was amazing, whatever FreeFrom is doing. Yeah, it's great for the community. Like, there is just one question posted just now. It says, excellent presentation. What is more data you would like to capture to further quantify this issue?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Tanya. I can jump in if that's.
Yeah, go for it.
So I think we are interested in, we're interested in understanding some of the differences in the way that economic abuse, both the cost of it and the types and experiences around it that differ between different groups of survivors. And so understanding, are there different costs or more costs or things for certain survivors of color compared to white survivors, or cisgender female survivors versus trans or non-binary survivors. So really trying to shine a light on survivors who are typically left out of the conversation and possibly don't feel sort of seen, heard, welcome in the typical services, and really using this opportunity to both provide grants to that community, to those communities, and also to be able to have data to sort of fuel more work in that direction. So that's definitely one thing that I think is at the top of our minds. Tanya, I don't know if you have additional things to add there.
Yeah, I think FreeFrom is also really trying to envision a non-carceral approach to gender-based violence. So that means independent of law enforcement or the justice system, and that is completely left to the survivor's discretion. So I think we're also interested in understanding how the current carceral response to gender-based violence is impacting survivors of color and survivors who are trans, since they are the folks who are the most impacted by police brutality, by different systems of oppression within our law enforcement system. So I think that that's also a piece that we'll probably be looking into in future data.
Anybody else? Don't be shy. We'd love any questions that you have, comments or anything these last few minutes here.
Kirkley, I had one question, just from my perspective. So when you so there are a few other data sets which are available, right, from government chats or some universities doing research. So do you also envision that you can get more data from them, and that it can help your process as well in terms of more identification of helping more or reaching out more in terms whatever FreeFrom is doing?
So sorry, your question is if we will be...
Yeah, if you get more data sets, right, you can leverage more data sets which are available from the consensus and other divisions of LA County as well, right? Because there are a lot of impacts because of this COVID-19, and a lot of different organizations are doing research. So is there any thing where FreeFrom is doing more partnerships with other data sets and leveraging their data sets to help more people?
Yeah, that's a really great question. At the moment, we are partnering with an international organization, or sorry, yes, they're international, they're in the UK. But what we're trying to do is we've partnered with a nonprofit that does very similar work with us in the United Kingdom. And we're working with them on a global landscape review to try to understand what economic abuse looks like globally, and what those sort of differences are, and really generate kind of a global policy working group sort of suggestions for addressing economic abuse around the world. So that's one partnership that we have with data. And honestly, I attended a webinar earlier this week about just cash grants, not to survivors specifically, but giving cash grants out to individuals during COVID. And you're exactly right. There's tons of data being generated, particularly around this idea of unrestricted cash. And I think we are eager to sort of use all of that data to help sort of fuel this kind of work going forward. And then this other partnership to understand economic abuse globally. I would say those are our two main partnerships at the moment, if that answers your question.
Okay. Yeah. That's really helpful. And again, thank you very much, Kirkley, and thank you very much, Tanya. It was a lovely presentation. At least it was a good learning exercise for me, and hope for all the attendees as well. And still, the attendees can contact all the contact the speakers if they have any further questions, and you will be able to see the questions in WOA. And please feel forward to put your comments and feedback on the website in WOA or with the organizers. And thank you very much, and have a wonderful day. And thank you for being a part of DataCon. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for stopping in on Saturday.
Bye.
Bye.